So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Nicola Morgan. Nicola Morgan, aka the Teenage Brain Woman, is an internationally acclaimed authority on the learning brain and the effects of stress, screens, social media, and reading for pleasure. She was a multi-award winning novelist before writing her best-selling examination of the teenage brain, Blame My Brain, which was shortlisted for the Aventis Prize, and then the Teenage Guides to Stress, Friends and Life Online, Positively Teenage, Body Brilliant, and Exam Attack. Her unique range of teaching materials, including video, allows schools to bring Nicola's reassuring expertise into their classrooms. In 2018, she was awarded the SLA's prestigious award for outstanding contribution to information books. So over to you, Nicola.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura, and thank you to Cambridge University Press for inviting me to do this. I normally start by saying that it's lovely to see you all, but of course I can't see you all. And even though I've done a few of these types of events now, I still haven't got used to the fact that I can't see you all. I can't see how you're reacting. I can't see whether you're nodding in agreement or shaking your heads in disbelief or anger. I can't see if you've fallen asleep. And I find that really, really hard. But one of the fantastic things about doing things online was illustrated just as you were all arriving and seeing all of those countries arriving. So countries just all around the world. And one of the things I love about doing events for schools in this new environment is that I can equally well do an event for a school in any country in the world or down the road from me, and it's the same cost and it's the same amount of energy and it's the same experience. So that's, there are good things to be said about this situation that we have. Now I'm going to start sharing my screen because we haven't got very long. So, and I'm trusting that Laura will say if that is not all right. So she hasn't said anything, so that must be, we must be there. I've chosen to focus, and I've been asked to focus on the learning brains in your classroom. So I talk and write about all aspects of young people's and particularly teenage lives, teenage brains and teenage lives, and all the aspects of them. And Laura mentioned some of them in her introduction. But in this short talk, I'm going to be focusing on the things that will affect how they learn. So the learning brains in your classroom. Now, you've heard me referred to as the teenage brain woman. So most of what I do, as I say, is specifically about teenagers. But there's not really so much difference between the learning brain of a teenager and how things like stress affect it compared to slightly younger brains and older brains. So those of you who don't teach teenagers, but who teach younger children in primary school, and particularly those of you who teach upper primary, the older primary years, you will equally well find what I'm going to say be relevant to you, because it's all about things that get in the way of learning in the classroom. Now, in this short talk, obviously, I'm only going to be able to pick out some selected highlights, what I think are the most important aspects of the topic. And if you want to find out much, much more, you will find more on this topic and all the other topics that I write about on my website. If you go to my website and you go to the blog section, you will see some handouts. You'll see a blog post that I put up yesterday, especially for this conference, with lots and lots of handouts and downloadable resources, things that you can use in your schools and indeed in your families. You'll also find lots of references. So when I talk about the science, it's really important that you don't just believe what I say, that you go and look at the science that I look at when I make my insights and judgments and conclusions, and see what you think of the science and see whether you agree. You'll also find lots of teaching materials and online talks. This presentation, Laura mentioned that the presentations are not going to be made available. I will make it available on my website, but I just need to check with Cambridge University Press that that's okay for me to do that. So specifically in this talk, what I want to share with you is why it can be, why it's sometimes difficult for the young people in your classroom, those people sitting in front of you, why it is difficult for them to hear you, and why they sometimes don't hear what you say. Even though they may be sitting there looking as though they're listening, they may not be hearing what you say. And that really is about what may be going on in their brains and lives, which gets in the way of learning, which hinders learning. And I will show you at the end where to find solutions to this, but in this particular talk, I won't have time to offer specific solutions. But as I say at the end, I will show you where you can find lots and lots and lots of solutions. The first thing that I'd like you to remember and to think about this really as you go about your daily lives, whether in your work or your own personal lives, is that humans, and other animals as well, but humans are wired to do particular things, to behave in particular ways. And that wiring, that programming is very, very ancient. Our brains, even though so much has changed in the last few years or few decades, our brains are still wired and programmed exactly as they were many, many, many thousands of years ago. And so we are wired to behave in certain ways. When I say we, I mean all of us, whatever age we are wired to behave in certain ways. And those things that we are wired to do are either or both for our survival or for our success. So they're wired into us in order to make the human species and we individuals in it survive and succeed. And so three things particularly that I want you to remember that we are wired to do. Firstly, we are wired to be social. Being social is critically important for humans as a species and as individuals for our survival. We do better, we survive better when we are in groups, when we have supporters, when we know who to turn to, and we succeed better in groups as well. Even though many of us also love and many of us prefer to work on our own, but we still need those social groups. We still do better when we have a support network. So we are wired to do everything possible to be social. We're also wired to be curious. And of course, as teachers, this is what you want your students to be. You want them to be curious. And that's good because we are wired to be curious. So that means that when there's something there, something that we could look at, we will look at it. We are wired to look at it and find out about it and to try it. And that is not so much for survival, but more for success. We do better. The more curious we are, the more we learn and the better we do. And we also are programmed to be distracted. So if you think back to tens of thousands of years ago and those hunter-gatherers, if the hunter, when looking at the prey, was so focused on the prey that he didn't notice that there was a lion creeping up from the side, then that would be really bad for his survival. So we're programmed to be distracted. When the gatherer gathering berries in the bushes was so focused, so concentrating on the berries that they didn't see the snake slipping along in the grass, then that would be really bad for survival. So we are programmed, we are wired to be highly distractible, particularly by moving things. So remember those three things because it's going to become very relevant as the talk goes on. And indeed, as you think about the young people in your classrooms and in your families in other contexts as well. So thinking about adolescence then, and by the way, I should point out that when I say teenagers or adolescents, I'm not talking necessarily about people who are aged 13 to 19. I'm talking about people as young as 10 or 11, because that's usually when the brain changes and the behavioral changes start to happen in our young people. So what makes adolescence special then compared to how younger children are and compared to how adults are? For me, there are two ways. There's firstly the brain, so the internal biological differences that set adolescents apart from different age groups. And then there's the stage of life, so the external social things. So you've got biology, which is internal and is going to be relatively the same, whoever you are, wherever you live, whatever century or generation you're born into, because it's a human stage of development. And then there's the stage of life, the external social things, which may well change between different communities, different rules that we have, different things that the people are going through. So those two things are going to make teenagers or adolescents somewhat different from younger people and older people. And it's very helpful when we think about adolescence, and we think about if you're an upper primary teacher and you're seeing the young people who are aged 10 or 11 starting to become a little bit different, but then also thinking about it throughout the whole of secondary school. It's very helpful to think of this in evolutionary terms as having a purpose. It has the point of independence. So the destination, the desired destination at the end of adolescence is independence. So adolescence is a stage of development which is evolved to take a young person away from being protected and dependent, so in the family unit, towards being unprotected and independent. And that is necessarily a form of separation. Young people at some point, it's not going to happen instantly, but gradually during that quite substantial number of years in humans, at some point they are going to be separating. They are gradually separating from the protection of the family unit or the teachers doing everything for them, separating from that. So they've got to become less dependent. They've got to start to trust us less. We want them to trust us, but they have to biologically start to trust us less and become separated. Otherwise, how are they ever going to be independent? And some of the problems that can happen, and they don't happen for everyone because everyone is also individual, some of the problems that can happen come from this act of separation. It's like a type of what we call separation anxiety almost. The problems can be insecurity. So we're separating from that security, we feel insecure. Another problem can be conflict. So again, not always, but very often, there is conflict between the teenager and whether it's the parent or the teacher, as they're breaking away, as they're stopping trusting us and believing us and stopping thinking that we know everything. They've got to start doubting us so that they can start putting their own values and decisions in place. And peer pressure becomes extremely important, perhaps the most important driver or pressure during this period is from peer pressure, because as the young person is separating, breaking away from dependence on the adults, the parents and the teachers, because we're wired to be social, and because being social gives us strength and gives us success, then they've got to build their bonds with some other people. And those will be the people around them, the people who are their peers, the people of their own age. So they start to trust their peers more than they trust their adults. And they need to do that. They are biologically wired to do that, to do what their peers want them to do more than what we want them to do. So that's how I describe what, in general terms, without going into the brain details, which I will do in a minute, but that's how I describe what I feel makes adolescence, that growing up, becoming adult stage, special. So during that time, the most important brain difference that we need to be aware of, and which goes to explain so many things that we notice about young people and their behavior, their stereotypical behavior, is that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain right at the front of the, just right behind the forehead, the very front of the brain, is the last part of the brain to develop. And it doesn't finish its development until well into the 20s. So even though all teenagers are different and some will finish their development earlier than others, none of them will have a fully developed prefrontal cortex while they're at school, while they are a learning brain in your classroom. And this is important because the prefrontal cortex is often called the control center. It's responsible for what we might arguably call the human functions of the brain, the things that we feel that humans do that other animals don't do, or at least that we do in a more developed way than other animals might do. So things to do with control, making decisions, making controlled decisions based on, for example, what we think might happen if we do this thing that we want to do. What might happen? What are the risks? What might the benefits be, either in a few minutes or a few hours or a few years? So all the decision making, controlling our impulses, controlling our emotions, controlling our anger, controlling our excitement, our risk-taking, all of those things, the control of those, the sensible parts of our behavior happen in the prefrontal cortex. And teenagers' prefrontal cortices are not fully developed. Some may work, some do work much better than others, but none of them have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. But another set of areas, the limbic system, and particularly the amygdala, which is where we find the stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze, the instant gut instinct behavior, that set of areas is very well developed in teenagers, and indeed in much younger children. It's very well developed in all of the children in your classrooms, whatever age they are, even if they're only 4 years old. The limbic system is well developed. And the limbic system is where all of the things happen that you might call the opposite of control. So everything to do with emotion and impulse and desire and reward and the reaction to things rather than the thinking about things. So it's instinctive, it's very impulsive, it's where temptation happens. And so if you think about the fact that in the young people in your classrooms, they have all got a very well developed limbic system and stress response set of areas, and all of those emotional areas, but they have all got a less well developed prefrontal cortex, then you can start to see why we see problems, again, not in every young person, but why we so often see problems in these things in young people more than we do in adults. But let's not think that adults are always fully in control. I don't know about you, but I am sometimes not fully in control of my emotions, and I do fly off the handle sometimes. I do make wrong decisions based on my emotions, but I have a better chance than a teenager of getting it right. And all of us as adults have a better chance than teenagers and younger children of not having problems with these things. So things to do with anything to do with emotional control, whether it's the fact of emotions going up and down and being very volatile, or it's our responses and understanding of the emotions. Empathy involves understanding the emotions in someone else, and that requires the prefrontal cortex. Impulse control, obviously, I've kind of covered that. Peer pressure, I've mentioned being a very, very strong pressure in young people, but you can see how if your peers are encouraging you or will give you kudos and status for doing a particular risk-taking activity, let's say, you're likely to do that because that is driven from your limbic system. That's an urge, it's a desire to do something, and a failure or a refusal to let the prefrontal cortex come along and say, hang on a minute, maybe I shouldn't do that silly or risk-taking thing. And also, critically, for when we're thinking about young people in our classrooms, controlling where our attention goes, controlling our focus, bringing our focus back when we've been distracted. And remember, we're wired to be distracted. So that's the most important brain difference or brain thing to think about. But let's think about stress now. So that's biological as well, but it's also the stage of life will bring you different stresses. So let's always remember, and let's teach our young people, that stress is not evolved to be a negative thing. It's evolved to be positive. It's a positive biological response to any threat, and it's evolved for our survival and for our success. So it's wired into us. So when we have any threat, anything that our brain perceives as a threat, and this is happening in the limbic system, not in the prefrontal cortex, it's very, very instinctive. Adrenaline and cortisol rush around our body, speed up our heart rate and our breathing to send more oxygen and more glucose to the muscles that we might need if we have to run away from a lion or whatever else it is. And our attention focuses very, very strongly on the thing that we're meant to be focused on. So we can often not notice peripheral things, not notice irrelevant things. We're focused on the thing in front of us. And the result of that is, or should be, super performance. So stress is biologically there to help us super perform, and it's very helpful to teach young people that it's not a bad thing to feel stressed before an exam. You need to feel stressed before an exam, but we need to control that stress so that we're not overcome by it, because we can be overcome by it. So let's look at what the problems might be then with stress. We can have a problem with too much adrenaline, either too much of it, so we feel panicky, or too often or at the wrong time. So we feel anxious and nervous when we're not just about to do a test. We want it when we're just about to do a test. We don't want it a week before or the night before when we're trying to get to sleep or we're trying to relax in some way. So that can be a problem. And teenagers or young people need to be taught strategies to deal with that. And there are lots in my website, which I'll mention at the end. Then the second problem is that cortisol has a habit of building up. And cortisol, when it builds up, it has a whole load of negative effects. And when we talk about someone suffering from stress, this is usually what we mean. It's a cortisol buildup. It's lots and lots of little stresses have been coming along during the day, and the cortisol is still hanging around from the previous one, and so it builds up. And that can very quickly affect our sleep, affect our concentration, affect our mental health and mood, and even affect our immune system. So we become more vulnerable to colds and minor illnesses. But the third thing is, the third problem with stress is that our brains can have our brain bandwidth over-occupied. And this is a whole fascinating topic. If you're interested in it, then I think the best book to illuminate the issues with brain bandwidth is The Organized Mind by Daniel Levitin. I'm a big fan of that book. So brain bandwidth, another way of thinking of it is attention span. It's what you can focus on or do at any one time. And it's limited, it's finite. We only have a certain amount of it. There isn't a way of stretching it. You can't exercise it and have more of it. You've only got the amount that you have. And everything that we do, whether it's mental or physical action, uses some of it. Think of it as well in the same way as you think of computer or Wi-Fi bandwidth. So some things just use a little bit and some things use a lot. And the way to tell whether you're using a lot is very simple. If you're having to concentrate very much on something, you're using a lot of bandwidth. So you can think that some things like brushing your hair and getting dressed in the morning occupy very little brain bandwidth. You don't really have to think about those things very much. But learning to drive a car or learning some new information occupies a lot more brain bandwidth. And I want you to think about some things that occupy a particularly large amount of brain bandwidth. And think about whether you think these things are occupying bandwidth of the learning brains in your classroom, whether it's teenagers or younger people, and also how they would affect you if they're happening as well. So the first big thing that occupies a lot of brain bandwidth is any worry. So any big bad thing, whether it's a real thing happening in your life or something that you're scared might happen, or something negative that someone has said to you that's very undermining, that's going to occupy a lot of brain bandwidth. Anything new, so any new situation, new person, and also new information. So processing information is effectively taking in something new. And processing that, whether by reading or listening, uses a lot of brain bandwidth. It might interest you to know that it's been estimated that, and this will be different for different people and at different times, but on average, listening to the human voice occupies more than half of your brain bandwidth, which explains very neatly why none of us are able to listen to two voices at the same time and understand them. You could be listening, you could be hearing two, but you won't be hearing them properly. You won't be hearing them in a way that you can understand or recall what's being said, because each one would occupy more than half. The next thing that occupies a lot is anything that we read on screens, especially if the screens are connected to the internet or have social media on them. And that's because when we read on a screen, especially on the internet and with social media, we have got there are a lot of things coming in, a lot of information coming into our eyes, into our mind, as well as the words that we're trying to read. So we're trying to read some words and we've got adverts, we've got other windows, we've got notifications, we've got hyperlinks. And the final thing that occupies a lot of brain bandwidth is controlling our impulses, resisting temptation. So when you're looking at a screen and you see a hyperlink or an advert pops up, and you resist the temptation to click on it, which you would think is the sensible and right thing to do if you're trying to read the information, the act of resisting the temptation to click on the hyperlink is actually using a lot of brain bandwidth as well. So when we read on screen, we are necessarily multitasking, and we are not, which explains why we, people of all ages, young and old, are not so good at processing information that they have read on a screen compared to reading it in print. And all of this affects all of us in some way, whatever age we are, but it affects teenagers and young people more than it does adults, because it's the prefrontal cortex that we use to direct our brain bandwidth onto the task. So if we've got a big worry in our mind and we've got a task to do, a piece of homework or listening to the teacher or reading something, we use the prefrontal cortex to direct our attention away from our worry and onto the task. And that's difficult to do for us. You know, when you have a big worry, how difficult it is to focus on your work. It's more difficult for young people because they don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. And they may also have a lot more things going on occupying their brain bandwidth because they've got all of these peers around them, saying negative or positive things to them, or even giving them glances, all of the pressures that they've got. They may have more things occupying their bandwidth. And when our brain bandwidth is overoccupied, we can't hear properly. And this is the single main reason why the young people in your classroom may often not hear you properly, because their brain bandwidth is occupied by something, a worry or whatever it is. And then we don't retain the information so well. Even if we've heard it, we find it harder to remember it afterwards. And it doesn't feel nice. Having our brain bandwidth overoccupied, we can manage it for a little while, but it feels exhausting. It feels stressful. It feels unpleasant and nasty. It affects our well-being and it affects our learning. So if you add all of this up, everything that you've learned in the last half hour, nearly half an hour, so the weaker prefrontal cortex with a strong limbic system of younger people, add to that the teenage life stresses and the stresses in upper primary as well, from everything to do with being wired to be social, everything to do with school, whether it's teachers asking you questions that you don't know the answer to, remembering that you've done the wrong homework, or you don't understand what the teacher's saying, all of the anxieties and all of the peer pressure. And when you add in your new understanding of brain bandwidth overoccupation, you can see that what you typically get, very, very often get in your classroom, is a young person whose brain and mind is overwhelmed and not in a good place for hearing what you want them to hear. And more specifically, rather than giving you just the rather wonderful cartoon picture, the young brains, I would argue, in your classroom are more at risk than adults are from having their emotional life, their emotional brain, overpowering their reason, because the limbic system is more powerful for them than their prefrontal cortex. They are at risk from peer pressure because we are wired to be social and we're wired to do the things that our peers want us to do. And it's really interesting actually to know that adults are also wired to do that. It's just that we have stronger prefrontal cortices, which make it easier for us to do the right thing and to resist peer pressure when it should be resisted. They're at risk from distraction. Remember, we're all wired to be distracted, but they have got a lot of distractions going on, and many of the distractions are social. If they think that one of their friends requires them to do something or think something or say something, that is not only being wired to be social, but also being wired to be distracted. They may have, are likely to have, compared to older people like us, more difficulty in looking ahead, so predicting what the consequences might be of a particular action. So it'll be more difficult for them to make good choices. Often they will make good choices, but very often they won't. And also with the ability to look ahead comes the ability, when we're in a difficult situation or a sad situation, as in so many countries around the world, including here in the UK, we are at the moment with COVID in a difficult situation and so much negativity going on. It is, if you find it difficult to look ahead, you will find it difficult to feel hopeful, to see that there could be light ahead, to see that one day you might not feel so overwhelmed. And they will have more difficulty in ignoring a worry. If they've got a worry in their mind while you're trying to teach them, they will have more difficulty in pushing that worry aside, and more difficulty in focusing on the task in hand, compared to, so we can all be vulnerable to these risks, but young people in your classroom are more vulnerable because of how their brains are and how their lives are. Now, I said at the beginning that there wouldn't be time to give you specific solutions and strategies, and I know you will be wanting solutions and strategies, because of course everyone does. But my firm belief, and I've never changed in my belief, it's good to change beliefs sometimes, but I've never changed this particular belief, is that understanding gives you power. And I believe that if we, whoever we are, whether it's me, whether it's you as a teacher, whether it's someone as a parent, and whether it's a young person themselves, if we understand why we're doing something, why we feel the way we do, then we're more than halfway towards knowing how to deal with it. Understanding how something works, in this case, the human brain and human behavior, gives us so much more control over how we make it work. And as I say, that's the same whether it's us as adults trying to help young people with their brains and lives, or whether it's young people themselves trying to have control over their brains and lives. And so in terms of where specifically you can find the strategies and solutions that I suggest, and if I'm doing a longer talk, an inset session for schools, then this is what I would be doing. I would be explaining a lot of the things on my website and in my books. So where to find them? As I said at the beginning, you've got the handouts on today's blog. On my website, you'll find masses of free advice. I don't know if you've been there yet, but if you haven't, then prepare to drink several cups of coffee while you're on it, because it is a big website with lots and lots of free advice. Obviously, my books are written for teenagers, directly speaking to teenagers and their families, but adults, teachers and parents very often read them as well. And I also have teaching materials. Thank you very much for listening. I really do hope that you have found many things in that have been eye-opening. I think that it's not going to be, oh, I never knew that, but I think it's when you bring those ideas together and you start to relate them to how you feel when you feel stressed, or when you're trying to listen to someone, you're trying to take in information, and you start to think about some of the things that may be going on in the learning brains in your classroom. I think that you will start to find your own solutions. You're the teachers. I used to be a very, very long time ago, but I'm not now. You have the skills and the power, and now you have the knowledge and the understanding to find your own solutions, your own ways to empathize with the learning brains in your classroom, and together with them to bring the best out of them and give them the best teaching, best learning experience they can have, and the best teaching experience that you can have. Thank you very much for listening. I will now stop the share and see if we've got any questions. Oh, I can see lots of Q&A. So Laura, I think you're
Nicola.
going to pick them.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. You did so well to fit so much information into a short session. Lots of really insightful comments and questions as well coming through on the chat. Obviously, lots of people want the answers, but you've directed them to the right place. I also remember that a lot of your books have been published in different languages.
Yes, in kind of very varied languages. So there's no country where they're all published, but many countries where one or two of them are published.
So people can go and find stuff and read in their L1 if they want to. Um, I guess a simple question to start off with, can you give us a synonym for bandwidth?
I think there are two ways of thinking about it. A synonym is probably attention span. That probably encapsulates it more than anything I can think of. But I think bandwidth is also really useful to think of because of the link, and I assume this is the same in other languages, the link with broadband or Wi-Fi bandwidth, because the analogy is quite strong, because bandwidth, broadband or Wi-Fi bandwidth or computer bandwidth is also finite. I know you can buy more, but you can't stretch it. So once you're using a lot of it, so for example, if you live, as I do, in a place where we don't have very, very good fast broadband, we notice in the house if other people in the village are doing lots of streaming, and we notice that the things on our computers or our television go more slowly. And it's the same in the brain, that if you're doing something in your brain that uses a lot of the bandwidth, other things will work less well or more slowly. So I think attention span, because it's about bandwidth, is what you can do now. It's not about what you were doing, how much you've learned in the last hour. It's what your brain can do now. So it's to do with multitasking. That's another way of thinking about it. When we overuse our bandwidth, we are multitasking, and it's why multitasking doesn't work very well. But attention span is a reasonable synonym, but it's really important to think of it as bandwidth in the same way as computer or Wi-Fi bandwidth.
Thank you, that's really clear. So an interesting question from Laura: how can we take advantage of distraction and limbic system functions to enhance learning, as opposed to expecting control and focus or take it for granted? So I guess, how do you put a positive spin on the developing brain?
Yeah, so I think the positive spin for distraction is the same as the idea that we're wired to be curious. So we love that our students are curious. So being distracted by an advert or someone saying something or something new is in a way the same as being curious, wanting to know about it. But the fact that we're wired to be distracted helps explain why, as teachers, we are often told that we need to keep our lessons interesting. We need to keep lots of variety in them, because the variety helps with the distraction wiring and also the curiosity wiring. If you have a lesson which is an hour long and it's all the same activity, then a few of the children will be fine with that because they're loving the activity, but obviously most of them won't. They will switch off. So I think it helps to put a bit of brain spin on why we typically, and younger people more so than us, are likely to switch, our concentration to switch off after a certain amount of time. So we need something new. We're also wired for novelty, which is very similar to being wired for distraction. We're drawn to things that are new, things that spark our interest. It wakes up the brain, stimulates it with the chemical, the neurotransmitter dopamine, which makes us more ready to learn. So if we can introduce things that are new and different and varied into our lessons, then so much the better. And obviously that's really difficult to do, because you can't always put new things in, because you're trying to teach them to be expert at the things that they're not quite good enough at yet. So they've got to keep practicing the old as well as the new. But if we can vary what we're doing, even if it's not something brand new coming in, it's new to that lesson, or we did it on Monday, so now let's do it again on Friday, and it'll still feel new. So I think it just gives a bit of context for why it's good to teach with variety.
Brilliant. So Fatima's asking, she's heard that the younger brain learns languages better, for example, learns generally better, and how does that work, if that's the case?
Yeah, so people do find it easier to learn things when they're somewhat younger compared to somewhat older. But it's also true that we're capable of learning things at any stage of our lives. And young people sometimes find it harder than older people to learn, because young people sometimes find it hard to know why they should. If they know why they should and they're interested in it, or if they can't avoid it, then they may be better at learning than we are as older people. But if I tried to learn something new, I would also be very self-motivated, and self-motivation is very helpful. But in terms of why it's usually the case that younger people learn things like languages better, if we look at particularly, so the age at the very beginning of adolescence, so that 10 to 11 to 12-year-old age time, at that stage, what's happening in the brain is a very, very significant increase in the volume of grey matter. Now, grey matter is neurons and the connections between them. And what seems to be happening is not so much that we're growing new neurons, new nerve cells. It's mostly that they're growing new connections. So they're sprouting. It's like a tree in spring, sprouting lots and lots and lots of extra connections spontaneously, not because the young person is doing anything. Just to put that into context, normally we grow new connections when we do things. So the more we practice something, the more brain connections we're growing. But this is different from that. This is something that seems to happen spontaneously and naturally at the very beginning of adolescence, this big blossoming of neural connections. Now, they don't need all of those neural connections. And in fact, during the middle part of adolescence, so aged roughly, very, very roughly, because everyone is different, but 14 or 15 to 17 or so, they will lose a whole lot of connections. But it seems to be that during that time of early adolescence, so 10, 11, 12, 13, up to 14-year-olds, seems to be a really peak time for the ability to learn new skills. That then can peak again later. So university students, for example, will typically be at the peak of their powers in a particular area. So whatever they've chosen to study, whether it's maths or sport or whatever it is, will peak in terms of the brain connections and strengthening of the connections in those areas. But as younger teenagers, so upper primary, lower secondary, I'm speaking in a UK way there. I don't know if that relates to all countries, but age 10 to age 13 or 14 or so, you've got all of these extra connections, so they're there available for whatever skills you want to put them to.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I think that's about all we've got time for today. So thank you so much, Nicola, for such an interesting session. Thank you all for joining us today.